Oh, this is a video. It's basically a rebuttal video to Mr. Beats' top 10 presidents of all time. He goes through and lists who he thinks are the 10 best presidents, and I rebut. I agree with some of them, but I rebut some of the other ones he puts on here and give some reasoning and kind of his reasoning for rating them highly too. So we'll just start rebutting right now.
Number 10, James Garfield.
I have to disagree on this one for one very easy and simple reason. Garfield was only president for about 6 months, and he spent about 2 of those months laid up in the hospital trying to recover from his assassin's attempt on his life. So he really never got to be president, and I don't dislike Garfield, but you definitely can't call him one of the 10 great presidents because he just really didn't get an opportunity to do anything. Also, I don't believe you should rate presidents on anything other than what they did as president, and he really only appointed some people, and that was about it.
One of our smartest presidents in history. I mean, by many accounts, he was very intelligent.
Um, Being intelligent doesn't make him great. You can be intelligent and be a good president, or intelligent and be a bad one.
He was a self-made man. Started from the bottom, now we're here, okay? Lost his father when he was young, worked to pay for an education, eventually became a businessman and a professor, and then, of course, later a politician, a representative, also a successful military leader for...
There were quite a few presidents that were in the military. In fact, most presidents were. If you go from um, up through everyone before Clinton, it was actually common for people that were in the military to be presidents, with the exception of the era of Clinton on, and then Wilson through Franklin Roosevelt. Most of the other presidents were actually in the military at one point or another. I mean, even Lincoln fought in the Black Hawk War. You'd have a few like Jefferson and Madison and the Adamses that didn't, but most presidents actually were members of the military. So this really isn't a reason to rank someone as a great president, even beyond the fact that it doesn't have anything to do with his presidency.
the Union in the Civil War. As president, he appointed many African Americans to posts in his administration, which was unheard of at the time.
I don't know if that claim is actually true or not, but we do know that other presidents had far better records even back then when it comes to African Americans. Lincoln freed the slaves. Grant did everything he could to help African Americans, which is what Reconstruction was about. And Benjamin Harrison did a whole lot of things to help African Americans during his presidency. So it wasn't rare for a president, especially a Republican president, to be a friend of African Americans back in the 19th century.
Now, he didn't last long in office as president. You may already know that he was assassinated shortly after getting into office, but he would have been amazing. And so what he would have been is why I rank him high.
This is the issue. You can't rank presidents on what you think they would have done, because any president that didn't finish out 8 full years in office, you could argue that if they had 2 full terms, they would have done this and that and make them either better or worse than they actually were. This is a really bad way to rate presidents. It really shouldn't be done. So yeah, I like Garfield personally, but not a top 10 president. I don't even rate him because I don't think he served long enough to be rated.
He made a name for himself fighting cronyism, fighting the political machines in Washington, D.C., and just fighting corruption in general. Number 9, James Madison.
I agree he's a top 10 president. We'll get into Mr. Beats' reasoning.
James Madison, the father of the Constitution, of course. Many of the best ideas of the Constitution that we take for granted came from him, and he pretty much wrote the Constitution.
All great things. If you're looking at things that presidents did outside of office, you would actually have to rank him higher than ninth, though. Writing the Constitution and the Bill of Rights would actually move him up the list above a lot of people. You'd be looking at Madison, Washington, and Eisenhower would get extra points for what they did before becoming president. So does Jefferson. But I would say Madison did more outside of office that was great than even Jefferson. So he does belong here because of what he did in the War of 1812 and the Barbary Pirates War, and the fact that he was willing to admit when he was wrong, and he recharted the National Bank, which became the second bank in the United States of America. So he's willing to do what was right, even if it was against his previous held political convictions. So he does belong in the top 10, but pretty much not for the reasons that Mr. Beat says so.
Okay, the Bill of Rights, most importantly, came from James Madison. So just on that alone, that's why he's one of my favorites. Now, as president, he also was a great leader in terms.
Also, the title of the video is the 10 greatest presidents, not his 10 favorite presidents. So they should be based on how great they were as American presidents.
Of once that War of 1812 broke out, he did an amazing job leading the charge to defend against the British invading the homeland. Now, he was a bit foolish when he called for war against.
I don't believe that calling for war was foolish because the British were basically violating Americans' rights. And the fact is, the outcome of the war was a very positive one. If you look at war as a means to an end, it was a very successful war because Britain was stopping, searching, and seizing American ships, taking citizens and forcing them into the British Navy, and they had forts within the United States territory, and they were inciting rebellions from Native Americans and uprisings from them. All of those things changed after the War of 1812, so the war was smashingly successful. The only thing that didn't happen was some people wanted to take Canada from Britain, but the people that were in Canada, a lot of them were the loyalists that left after the American Revolution. They didn't want to be American citizens, so that was actually a bad idea. But I don't think that was any part of the war aims of James Madison. He wanted to stop the British searching and seizing of ships, imprisonment of sailors, and the inciting of Native American uprisings. So it was a very successful war, and he did the right thing in standing up to the British because they would have continued to do those things until an end was put to it by somebody.
Against the British, but I digress. He was a key author of the Federalist Papers. And again, when he was my age, he was one of the leading voices at the Constitutional Convention. Number 8, John F. Kennedy.
Whereas I do think John Kennedy is a very good president, he's not a top 10 president. I'd say he's a top 15 president. He's like top third, maybe, if you rate all 445. He was very inspiring, very great speech maker and things like that, but you have to look at his whole presidency. And in his 3.5 years, he didn't get a lot done. I think this is another one that goes along with the James Garfield one, where he's rating him based on what he thought he would have done rather than what he actually did do.
I have a lot of respect for his World War II service. I mean, he saved a man's life.
Whereas that is very honorable. Once again, there were a lot of war heroes that became presidents. And his war service does not really affect his presidency.
For crying out loud. His leadership during the Cuban Missile Crisis was amazing. I mean, let's ignore the Bay of Pigs fiasco.
This is a problem when rating presidents. You can't ignore things you don't like. You have to rate a president on what he did as president and everything he did as president. So you have to count the Bay of Pigs. You have to count the fact that he did somewhat escalate things in Vietnam. You have to count those things against him the same way you count other things in favor of him.
During the Cuban Missile Crisis, he did well. He had learned from past mistakes. He had found...
I do agree that on his assessment of the Cuban Missile Crisis, however, but I don't agree that you should just ignore things you don't like.
A way to ease relations with the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War. He created the Peace Corps, the Equal Pay Act, which I don't think gets enough attention. And
the problem with an Equal Pay Act is that it would say everyone doing the same job should be paid the same exact amount. But there's quite a few issues there. Number one, if you have more experience, you get paid more. If you have better and more relevant education, you get paid more. If you do a better job, like if you have two people doing the same job, one person excels and one person struggles, shouldn't the person that excels get paid more? That's the problem with the Equal Pay Act, is that there are reasons other than some type of nefarious discrimination that lead to unequal pay.
Even though it was controversial, he moved civil rights legislation forward.
By the time Kennedy became president, civil rights really weren't that controversial. The only people that were against it were some people in the South, because they basically liked the idea of them being, a class above African Americans. The country largely wanted civil rights by the time Kennedy became president. They were ready for it.
He just gave really good, inspiring speeches. I mean,
Giving inspiring speeches is no reason to rate someone as a great president. Being a great speaker does not equate to being a great president. This is one of the biggest issues that people that rate presidents have. They like the way someone makes a speech and they say, oh, they're great. Plus, Kennedy never had a moment where he made a speech that it really was like the day in infamy by Franklin Roosevelt or the 9/11 speech by George W. Bush at Ground Zero, where it really was a moment that captured how everyone in the country was feeling. So even though he made great speeches, he didn't even have that super great moment.
still get fired up watching his moon speech at Rice Stadium. We shall go to the moon. I mean, I'm fired up. Number 7, Harry Truman.
I agree with this. I actually put Harry Truman in the top 5, but I'm not going to quibble that he puts him 7th, of course. That's, as close as most ratings would get. Harry Truman was a great president.
I used to think much less of Harry Truman when I was younger. I mean, I judged him based on his decision to drop the atomic bomb.
This was the right decision because not only did it save American lives, which is what he should have been worried about more than anything, it also saved Japanese lives because they were preparing to fight to the last person on every single island. So this was actually the right decision. People wrongly say it was the wrong decision looking back because they think, oh, we could have won without it, but he saved a lot of lives on both sides.
On Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and I didn't agree with that decision when I was younger, and I still struggle with that decision. And then there were other things that not to like about Harry Truman. The Truman Doctrine, which really was all about us beginning to police the world. And
false. The United States started policing the world under Teddy Roosevelt with the Roosevelt Corollary, but you could even argue a little earlier with we started policing the Western Hemisphere under Grover Cleveland with a lot of his interventionist foreign policy. So this wasn't like Truman all of a sudden comes out of nowhere and has an interventionist foreign policy. That foreign policy existed with Grover Cleveland, Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, and even Franklin Roosevelt. So to put that all on Truman really doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
Get up in everybody's business, some of his racist language that he used.
The fact is, what is seen as racist today would really not have been considered racist 60 or 70 years ago. He served in the 1940s and into the very early 1950s. The fact is, he was the first Democrat president that pushed for civil rights. He was the first Democrat president that really wasn't racist. So to go after him for having racist policies or having racist language kind of doesn't make sense. Even Warren Harding, who gave a speech in Alabama during his tenure in office in the 1920s, if you read the speech, it does sound kind of racist, but he was literally telling them that you need to stop being racist and treating everybody equally. But yeah, certain terms that were not considered racist in the 40s or the 20s are considered racist today. So you kind of have to look at the context of the times.
But then I learned more about Harry Truman, and the more I learned about him, the more I realized he was just a great common sense leader who really considered all sides to issues, and he just tried to do what was best for the majority. He didn't always get it right, but he certainly did whatever he could to make sure that every voice was heard. Plus, he played piano, and he's from the Kansas City area, so there's...
Playing piano and being from Kansas City should have nothing to do with your rankings as president. You shouldn't be a homer when ranking presidents.
That. Number 6, Theodore Roosevelt.
Disagree. And the fact is, this one is actually kind of funny when you see some of the other rankings he has. Theodore Roosevelt was the big interventionist foreign policy guy. So if you didn't like interventionist foreign policy of Truman, you really should have hit a Roosevelt and his Roosevelt corollary.
Growing up, Theodore Roosevelt was my favorite president. I mean, he was this larger-than-life figure that just seemed to be able to do anything, that was somebody who fought for the common man, and, I kind of lived him up more than he actually was.
This is actually common among historians and especially teachers, and this guy is a history teacher, either high school or junior high, I can't remember which. Theodore Roosevelt was kind of like the old Dos Equis commercials guys, the most interesting man in the world, because he probably was the most interesting man in the world when he lived. I mean, not only was he president, he fought during the Spanish-American War. He was a cowboy out west. He was actually a boxer at one point. He went on safaris in Africa. He explored the Amazon River. So he kind of was the most interesting man in the world, if that term would have existed at the time. And I think what that does is it gives history teachers someone really interesting to teach the kids about, which gets their attention a little bit more. So I think they like him because of that, because he makes their class maybe a little more interesting and fun for the students. But really, he was just a big self-promoter when it comes to being president more than anything.
I still respect Theodore Roosevelt tremendously. He went down the list just because of his foreign policy. The more I learned about his perception of the world, a bit too American-centered. He could have...
I don't blame a president for being American-centered in their foreign policy. You should actually be American-centered and look at what's best for America. What happened with Theodore Roosevelt is he really didn't do that. He basically was a big bully, for a better term of the word, and pushed around small, weak countries in Latin America because he pretty much could do so. He also intervened in Europe a few times with countries that were weaker as well. It's actually somewhat surprising that he never got the country into a war, because he was a really big warmonger.
I learned a lot more about other cultures, I think. But his boldness was undeniable. I mean, he was an active president before he was president.
Being active doesn't make you good. If you actively do a lot of bad things like Adolf Hitler did, and I'm not saying Theodore Roosevelt's Adolf Hitler, but it's just a very good example. Being active and bad is a very bad thing. You'd rather have someone that's not active than have someone that's active and actively pushes bad policies. Theodore Roosevelt pushed a lot of bad policies, and when he did push good policies, he generally did so by circumventing the Congress and the Constitution, which is a bad thing. So the problem was he pushed some bad policies, and he also did things in a bad manner that were overall bad for the country, because you don't want a president to act as a dictator, which Theodore Roosevelt had the idea in his mind that because he's the president and everybody in the country gets to vote for the president, he could do whatever he wanted unless the Constitution specifically said that he couldn't do it. But that's not how the Constitution works. It doesn't grant wide powers. It limits the powers of the federal government.
And then he even signed up to fight a war he was really passionate about. He wasn't just...
Being president during a time, being a person that's from the military doesn't make you a great president. There's more than 10 presidents that served in the military. Almost every president served in the military, with the exception of two eras in time. The Wilson through FDR era and the Clinton on era. Pretty much the rest of the presidents served in the military, or at least members of the military in one fashion or another. You'd have a couple odd ones that didn't, like, say, Grover Cleveland here. The Adamses there, Jefferson and Madison, that really weren't built for it. Maybe some of those guys like Buchanan, and I think Fillmore might have even served in the military in some capacity.
Just an advocate for the war, he actually fought in it, okay? He set new precedents for the role of president. He stopped strikes.
It's not a president's job to intervene between a business and their employees, so him stopping strikes was actually a bad thing, and he wasn't the first president to do so, although he did a far better job of it than what Grover Cleveland did, who basically just sided with the exploitive Pullman Company.
His push for national parks and his conservation efforts were amazing.
He couldn't have pushed for national parks without Benjamin Harrison putting in the Land Revision Act, and Benjamin Harrison's one of the presidents he dislikes a lot. So it makes very little sense.
He bypassed political parties and...
He didn't bypass political parties. He bypassed Congress and the Constitution. That's bad. He was still a politician. The reason why he ended the strike that he did, the coal strike, was because he didn't want the Republicans to suffer during a midterm election in 1902. So it was all political with him. He wasn't a non-political president, as Mr. Beach trying to make him out to be.
Institutions went straight to the people, straight to the media. You know, he loved the press, and he was the first to have the press in the White House. Theodore Roosevelt was all about justice. He was a tough son of a gun. Number 5, Dwight D. Eisenhower.
I agree with this one too. Eisenhower was a great president. Most of the reasoning he gives here does make sense for Eisenhower being great. There are a few things he goes through with his wartime leadership, because of course he loves that. which is odd because he doesn't like interventionist foreign policy, but he likes wartime, you know, leadership. Um, kind of, you like it, but you don't. But most of his reasoning is good for Eisenhower. Eisenhower actually reformed the Supreme Court and the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, which presided over the South, which is what really did a lot to bring about civil rights. That's the first civil rights legislation since Reconstruction under Grant. And he also refused several times to go to nuclear war when all of his generals pushed him to do so. There were like 6 instances where he refused this. So I believe that he deserves more credit for that. But he is a top 5 president, so I do agree here. I actually put Eisenhower a little higher than 5th. But once again, I won't quibble with a good rating.
Again, I'm a little biased here. Eisenhower was raised in Kansas, my home state, but another World War II hero, a phenomenal leader that helped the Allies get victory in that war. No one can deny the importance of his leadership for an Allied victory. Operation Overlord, the capture of Germany, that was him, and he later was the supreme commander of NATO, for crying out loud. He's a big reason why the Korean War ended, okay? He had a foresight to see what was going on with that. Let's just end this right now. The interstate highway system and NASA. I'm a fan of both, and that was him. He appointed Earl Warren as Chief Justice for the Supreme Court.
As I pointed out, it wasn't just that he appointed Warren, he appointed 5 justices to the Supreme Court, and he remade the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, which had a lot to do with civil rights and civil liberties that are enjoyed by a lot of people. These appointments really had a lot to do with that. He did have 1 weak appointment out of the 5, but if you get 4 to 5 right, putting in Supreme Court justices, that's actually a pretty good record.
Earl freaking Warren. Related to this, he sent federal troops to Little Rock to enforce school integration after the Brown v. Board of Education decision. Eisenhower was a fairly moderate dude. I mean, he saw the importance of social programs, but also saw the importance of a limited government protecting liberty. So he was a great balance of both. Number 4, Thomas Jefferson.
Jefferson's kind of like Kennedy. I put him near the top, but not quite in the top 10. This is another situation, but let him speak, and then I'll reply. I already watched the video, so I replied to all the Eisenhower stuff before the fact. I'll wait for him to say it, then I'll reply after the fact.
Definitely had some flaws, but I call him the father of civil liberties. I mean, he was a genius. I mean, the main author of the Declaration of Independence.
Declaration of Independence was written by a committee. Jefferson did pen it, and it was edited heavily. The other 2 main guys on the committee were Benjamin Franklin, who refused to do it because he would not have his work edited by anybody, and John Adams. And John Adams wanted Jefferson to write it. He said because Jefferson was a better writer, but what John Adams really wanted was to ensure that the southern states went along with the rebellion from Britain, which is why he pushed for Virginians to do high, significant things. It's part of the reason he pushed for Washington as general. It's part of the reason why he pushed for Jefferson to write the Declaration of Independence, because if Virginia was heavily tied to the rebellion, the rest of the South would more likely go along, as well as Virginia, if everything would have been done by people in Massachusetts. It would have been a rebellion of the New England states rather than all the colonies.
The Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, his passionate support for the Bill of Rights.
The Bill of Rights was written by James Madison before he was president and was passed during Washington's term of office, and Washington heavily backed it. Jefferson, as president, should not get any credit for the Bill of Rights.
And the fact that he popularized many of the ideas in the Bill of Rights. His views were always evolving. It's not like he had the same ideas his entire life. He's what we call a Renaissance man, right?
This is the crutch of why historians like him. He was a Renaissance man, and he was seen as a scholar. They like those qualities, so they lift him up because of those qualities. And I think that's why he's generally rated in the top 5 by most people that are historians and academics. He has kind of slid out a little bit. I think now he's like 6th or 7th because they now count him having slaves against him, but slavery was the norm at the time.
Right, he was constantly trying to better himself and learn new things. He can claim credit for the Louisiana Purchase, which...
The Louisiana Purchase is a reason to rank Jefferson as a great president. So is the Lewis and Clark expeditions in the First Barbary Pirates War, but you also have to look at his entire term in office. The Embargo Act and its and him, enforcing it was really bad. It's probably one of the dumbest acts that were ever passed by Congress. Um, he also fought the judiciary, trying to have federal judges removed from the courts, especially the Supreme Court. To impeach judges because you don't like their political views is wrong, and it's a good thing that this attack on the courts failed. So I think you have to look at everything he did, and when you start looking at everything he did, plus a lot of his things he did actually caused the War of 1812 beyond the embargo. He rejected a renewal of the Jay Treaty. He also created what they call the Mosquito Fleet, which means he quit making bigger ships that could go toe to toe with the military of like Britain or France, and created these little gunboats that could just kind of guard the coast to save money. And that kind of was an enticement to foreign countries because the United States would have a hard time defending themselves against these bigger countries. So he kind of was probably the president most responsible for the War of 1812 because of the way he acted towards Britain and his favoritism towards France.
Which was a bit controversial, but ultimately I think the right thing to do. He saw the good in common people. He promoted democratic ideals when most of the elite did not. So he saw the good in people. I've always liked TJ for that. Number 3, Calvin Coolidge.
Kind of like Jefferson and Kennedy, I believe he's a good president, but not a top 10 president. I just don't believe there's enough there to elevate him to the top 10. Coolidge was pretty much just a continuation of the Harding years in office. So all the big things that were done under Coolidge were pretty much just him continuing to carry out Harding's programs.
Probably the least egotistical of all the presidents, did not have an ego, actually probably weakened the power of the presidency.
Weakening the power of the presidency isn't a bad thing because by the time he became president, it had been overexpanded with presidents specifically like Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, so it should have been weakened vis-a-vis the other branches of government because the presidency wasn't meant to dominate the entire federal government.
The least political of all the presidents. That's great. I love apolitical presidents. Extremely modest dude, okay? He's kind of gotten a bad rap, though. My favorite quote of him, quote, "Perhaps one of the most important accomplishments of my administration has been minding my own business."
And this is odd because he liked Theodore Roosevelt for being very activist, but he likes Coolidge for not being activist. This is kind of the opposite. Coolidge, he's not 100% the opposite. He's probably actually as close to an opposite of Theodore Roosevelt as you get. Theodore Roosevelt was a huge self-promoter. Coolidge was very humble. Theodore Roosevelt was an interventionist in everything. Coolidge was not. Theodore Roosevelt, in domestic and foreign policy, which let's think domestic and foreign policy, Coolidge was not. Coolidge would allow the people to live their lives without government intervention, and Roosevelt wanted to jump in there and control everything. Very opposite presidents, so it's odd that you would put both of them up highly for that reason. You should actually rank them kind of much further apart than he does here. He's got Coolidge, third? And Roosevelt sixth? And they're so different, it makes very little sense.
While the president doesn't create jobs and isn't responsible for the entire economy, the economy did happen to do very well under his watch. More importantly, despite that, at the same time, he shrank the national budget, shrank the national debt, while simultaneously somehow figuring out a way to cut taxes. He was a fiscal...
Most of the people on here, I don't think are that bad with debt, so I can't remember. Like Garfield had no chance. Madison did run a debt during the war. JFK was decent. Truman and Eisenhower definitely good. 3R had a deficit, and he's one of the first peacetime presidents to run a deficit. Jefferson was good, so deficit reduction does jive with what he's saying here because he doesn't have any big spenders on this list, so I have to say he's at least being consistent in that way.
Fiscal conservative, but a social progressive, outspoken for women's rights and fighting corruption.
Another thing about Theodore Roosevelt, he didn't have a very good record when it came to civil rights. People make a big point about him having Booker T. Washington to the White House one time. But if you look at things like the Brownsville incident, the gentleman's agreement with Japan, and his making the Chinese Exclusion Act permanent, he really wasn't very good on civil rights. Theodore Roosevelt wasn't, but Coolidge was.
Had a humble foreign policy and anti-crony capitalism. He used common sense and spoke honestly. He never sugarcoated anything. My number 2 often surprises a lot of people, but it is Grover Cleveland.
This one completely makes no sense when you look at who number 3 is. Cleveland is very different than Coolidge. Cleveland had a horrible human rights record. He opposed women's suffrage. He stripped away protections for blacks in the South that had existed there before. He was against the workers in the Pullman strike. He was for the exploitive Pullman company. Coolidge signed an act that made all Native American citizens. Cleveland had the Dawes Act, which basically stole 2/3 of what was left of Native American land. So pretty much he was as really bad on civil rights. Another thing, I'll go a little further, let him speak some more. I'll try to rebut him as he says what he says.
And this may be a surprise even to people who've watched this channel for a long time. Grover Cleveland started out as a teacher. He was a classic liberal who believed in limited government.
He actually didn't believe in limited government. This is kind of false. He created the ICC, the Interstate Commerce Commission, which is basically a bureaucracy that acts as all 3 forms of government because they make rules, they enforce rules, and then they judge people to see if they broke those rules. He also created the Bureau of Agriculture and the Department of Labor. So he was for big government, not small government. And also the government intervening proactively in the Pullman strike was also another big government thing that he did.
Which explains the majority of his vetoes.
False. The majority of his vetoes were very simple. The vetoes were over pension bills for Civil War veterans. The reason why he was against these pension bills isn't because he was against big government. It's because the pension bills only covered Union veterans of the war. Confederate veterans were not covered by these pension bills, and he thought it was unfair that the Southern soldiers that fought against the United States government shouldn't get pensions. So basically, the reason why he vetoed those bills wasn't because they were a big expenditure or he was against big government. It's because he didn't like the fact that only Union veterans would get pensions from the government that they defended, and he thought that the people that fought in rebellion against the government should also get those pension bills. This is why Grover Cleveland was against all the pension bills. It's not some high moral standing he took. It's because he was against them because the Southerners didn't get them that fought for the Confederacy.
He had more vetoes than any other president other than FDR.
And vetoing a lot of bills is really, not a badge of honor. A good president would be able to get bills that they thought were good passed by Congress. Like, he had a Democratic Congress most of his time. He should have been able to work with them to get them to pass bills he found acceptable, or he should have been able to get them to not vote for bills he thought was unacceptable.
He had a humble foreign policy.
This is completely false. He was the first major interventionist president. He intervened in the Panamanian Rebellion to put that rebellion down in 1885. He intervened in the Brazilian naval revolt. He almost got in war with Germany and possibly Britain over Samoa when Germany was trying to take Samoa as a colony. When Santo Domingo basically dishonored France in some manner, France sought to punish him, which was actually normal for the time. He intervened there and almost got in war with France. He intervened in the Venezuelan crisis, which was a border dispute between Britain and Venezuela, which was something that was not covered by the Monroe Doctrine. So he was a very interventionist president. He did not have a humble foreign policy at all.
He was anti-interventionist. I think you know what I value here with my political beliefs, but he was a big proponent of free trade.
The whole tariffs are bad motif doesn't make sense because tariffs are a part of the president's toolbox. And when Cleveland lowered tariffs, he raised other taxes, so he was still taxing people the same way. The fact is, when he lowered tariffs, it backfired because more foreign goods came into the country, but foreign countries didn't lower their tariffs, so people in the United States lost even more jobs during the Panic of 1893. So it actually backfired on him. So he used tariffs wrongly. Plus, it should be noted that one of his other favorites, Teddy Roosevelt, didn't lower tariffs. He left tariffs high. So did Calvin Coolidge. He left tariffs high. So the idea that all tariffs are bad really is kind of a bad take by an historian because you actually have to look at the context of how the tariffs worked at the time frame, not just a dogmatic all tariffs are bad, idea towards them.
He was anti-crony capitalist probably more than any other president.
Actually, the ICC did help in some ways with crony capitalism because the bigger companies in the railroad industry could actually better, comply with them. Plus, his attorney general was a lawyer for the railroads, so he kind of helped the railroads, and that's why Cleveland come down on the side of the exploitive Pullman company during the railroad strike.
He fought the government corporate monopoly of the railroads before he became president.
The railroads were not a government corporate monopoly because the government did not own the railroads. And they also were not a monopoly because there was more than one railroad company. There were several. That's just a mischaracterization of what the railroads were.
He made a career out of fighting corruption and fighting the political machines of the day. And Grover was a man of integrity.
He was not a man of integrity. Beyond the racist policies he put forth, there's a woman named Maria Halpin, which it's pretty well proven that he raped her. And when she was pregnant and had a kid, he had her thrown in a insane asylum, and the doctor said she wasn't insane, and he took the kid and chucked him in an orphanage. And he disgraced her name, saying that she was a whore around town, when actually he raped her and forced himself on her and lied about it later. So he was not a man of integrity. He probably has the lowest integrity of just about any president, except maybe Andrew Jackson of the entire 19th century.
Strong moral compass. He put aside his own selfish desires.
No, he was pretty stubborn in his ways, which is why he would veto one pension bill, then another one, then another one, then another one. If all of Congress got passing these things, did he maybe ever think that this guy was just a big obstructionist? Pretty much.
Always for the greater good. What more could you ask?
Oh, the greater good argument's a really bad argument, because how does one person know it's for the greater good over everyone else? Couldn't they be wrong?
For a public servant of our country.
And my favorite president of all time
is George Washington, which...
I agree George Washington's the best president, so I can't quibble here. I'll let him go. Maybe I'll let him finish his whole thing here. He's got about 4 minutes, so I'll just let him go through his Washington thing. Probably not reply too much. Although we do know that war leadership will be one of the reasons why he ranks Washington so highly. We'll let him continue.
Which many of you already knew, George Washington, the first president, set all precedents, set the bar very high for all future presidents. Before he was president, though, he was a military hero. The French and Indian War, the Revolutionary War. More than anyone, he probably single-handedly is the person most responsible for the United States becoming a country, against great odds, against the most powerful military in the world at the time. George Washington was confident but humble. He never wanted to be president. He was kind of forced into that position. That's always been inspiring to me, that the fact that he limited his own power, he unwillingly took that position. When everybody wanted him to be king, he said no. The humility of George Washington has always inspired me. He limited his own power, and the great example of that is limiting himself to 2 terms.
The 2-term limit is one of the greatest things he did. He was just great as a president. All the stuff he did before was great. But, he set up the entire country as president. He set all the precedents. He made the cabinet be a thing, which wasn't really in the Constitution. Hamilton's policies to set up the economy all worked, even though people don't like Hamilton. He put down the Whiskey Rebellion. He's really the president. I would say he really made no mistakes as president, at least not any big ones.
And set that precedent for future presidents until FDR. He was president of the Constitutional Convention when the Constitution was made. He was against political parties. He warned against them. He warned against foreign entanglements and permanent alliances. The Proclamation of Neutrality. That's what I'm all about. His leadership ending the Whiskey Rebellion. He was out there personally leading the troops on a horse, for crying out loud. And George Washington, just an amazing leader, respected by all, unified all Americans. I can't imagine another president having as much impact as George Washington. And that will do it, ladies and gentlemen. Those are my top 10 presidents of all time. And next week, make sure you tune in, because I'm going to do the worst 10 presidents of all time. Who will be on that list? Tune in next week to find out. This has been a lot of fun. Thank you for watching.
The thing is, there's two kind of surprises for me here. I'm really surprised Abraham Lincoln didn't make the list. I know there are some people that just hate him because they like secession. I don't think Mr. Beat's that type of person. I would like to hear his ideas on Lincoln, though, but I'm surprised he doesn't make it because he did save the Union. He does belong in the top 5. Another one that I don't put in the top 10, but a lot of people do. The other Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt. So I'm kind of surprised because most people tend to seem to put him up in the top 10. So I'm kind of surprised he didn't put him up there. Once again, I would like to hear the reasoning, although it might be debt, because he said he doesn't like debt. That might be one reason why. Maybe he doesn't like that he ran for multiple terms. So those are just two surprises. Like I said, I agree with a lot of these. Definitely agree with like Washington, Madison, um, Eisenhower, and Truman. I mean, those ones were good, but Garfield I can't. Kennedy I can't really agree with. Teddy Roosevelt, Jefferson, Coolidge. I mean, granted, Jefferson, Coolidge, and Kennedy would be like my top 15 presidents, so they're not too far off. But some of these guys, like Grover Cleveland was awful. Teddy Roosevelt was pretty bad. I can't agree with those two. But I want to thank you for watching. Have a great day. Like, share, and subscribe.